On June the 22nd, 1945, two Japanese generals knelt in a cave on Hill 89 at the southern tip of Okinawa and committed ritual suicide, ending the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, a battle Japan had won tactically but lost strategically. This is the story of how superior defensive tactics, desperate courage, and calculated attrition failed to change the inevitable outcome of World War II. This is the story of how Japan lost Okinawa, and with it any hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. In the spring of 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether Japan would lose, but how quickly and at what cost. American forces had captured the Marianas, providing bases from which B-29 superfortresses bombed Japanese cities with impunity. The Philippine campaign had severed Japan's connection to its resource-rich empire in Southeast Asia. American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, lay at the bottom of the ocean or huddled in port, unable to contest American naval supremacy. Between the American forces and the Japanese home islands stood one final barrier: Okinawa, largest of the Ryukyu Islands, just 340 miles from mainland Japan. For the Americans, Okinawa represented the final stepping stone before Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. The island offered extensive airfield capacity for tactical and strategic bombing, protected anchorages for the massive invasion fleet, and staging areas for the million men being assembled for the assault on the home islands. Okinawa was not merely desirable, it was essential. For the Japanese, Okinawa was the last defensive position before the sacred soil of the home islands came under direct assault. Imperial General Headquarters understood that they could not hold the island indefinitely. American material superiority was overwhelming, but they believed they could make the Americans pay such a terrible price that Washington would accept something less than unconditional surrender. The strategy was simple: buy time through blood. In March 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved Operation Iceberg, the seizure of Okinawa. Admiral Chester Nimitz assembled the largest amphibious force in Pacific War history. More than 1,600 ships would transport 183,000 assault troops, with another 80,000 support personnel to follow. Task Force 58, the fast carrier. Task Force would provide air cover with hundreds of carrier-based aircraft. The British Pacific Fleet would support operations by neutralizing Japanese airfields on nearby islands. Command of the ground forces fell to Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., whose 10th Army comprised two corps, the 3 Marine Amphibious Corps and the 15th Voice Army Corps, totaling 8 divisions. These were not green troops. Many had fought on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and other blood-soaked islands across the Pacific. They were veterans of America's island-hopping campaign, hardened by combat and confident in their ultimate victory. Against this massive force stood the Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. A humane and thoughtful officer, Ushijima had served as commandant of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy before being ordered to Okinawa. His army initially consisted of approximately 77,000 combat troops, supplemented by 9,000 naval personnel and approximately 39,000 impressed Okinawan laborers and militia. Imperial General Headquarters had promised reinforcements, but American naval and air superiority prevented their arrival. In fact, Tokyo withdrew the experienced 9th Division to defend Formosa, weakening Ushijima's force before the battle began. The Japanese High Command made their strategic calculation clear: Okinawa was expendable. The real defensive battle would be fought on the home islands. Okinawa's purpose was to delay the Americans, to inflict maximum casualties, and to demonstrate the cost of invading Japan proper. The 32nd Army would be sacrificed to buy time, but Lieutenant General Ushijima and his staff had their own ideas about how that sacrifice would be made. Ushijima's chief of operations was Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, an Army Staff College instructor and tactical theorist. Yahara understood that conventional defensive tactics would fail against American firepower. The pattern had repeated itself on island after island. Japanese forces contested the beaches, launched counterattacks, and were annihilated by American naval gunfire, air power, and artillery. The 32nd Army would need a different approach. Yahara's plan, which he outlined in a pamphlet titled The Road to Certain Victory, represented a radical departure from previous Japanese defensive doctrine. The army would abandon the northern three-quarters of Okinawa, including existing airfield sites, a decision that shocked Imperial General Headquarters. Instead, the 32nd Army would concentrate in the southern quarter of the island where rugged terrain formed natural defensive barriers. The key to Yahara's plan lay in three parallel ridgelines that crossed the southern portion of Okinawa from coast to coast: the Kamikaze Ridge system in the north, the formidable Shuri Line in the center, and a final defensive position on the Kayam Peninsula in the south. These ridges were honeycombed with caves, tunnels, and underground positions that American naval bombardment could not destroy. Every position was carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered on likely American approach routes. The terrain itself became a weapon. The 32nd Army possessed the most extensive and well-directed artillery complement of any Japanese force in the Pacific War. Okinawa had served as an artillery training facility for years, and detailed terrain surveys allowed for devastating accuracy. Heavy mortars, including massive 320mm spigot mortars, supplemented the artillery. Machine guns covered every approach. The defenses were layered so that even if American forces captured one position, they would immediately face another prepared strongpoint. Yahara's tactical philosophy emphasized patience and discipline. There would be no banzai charges, no futile counterattacks that squandered troops for negligible gain. Japanese soldiers would remain in their fortified positions, forcing the Americans to come to them. They would let American firepower exhaust itself against rock and earth. They would emerge only to cut down attacking infantry at close range, then disappear back into their caves before American artillery could respond. The plan was brilliant. It was also fundamentally flawed because it could not address the core strategic reality: Japan had already lost the war. On the morning of April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history began. After days of preliminary bombardment by naval guns and carrier aircraft landing craft, carrying the first wave of American troops headed toward the Higuchi beaches on Okinawa's western coast, the troops braced for the familiar hell of contested landings. They remembered Tarawa, where Marines died by the hundreds before reaching the beach. They remembered Saipan and the savage fighting in the surf. They expected Japanese artillery to tear gaps in their ranks, machine guns to sweep the beach's suicide boats to ram their landing craft. By nightfall on April 1st, more than 60,000 American troops and their equipment were ashore. Casualties were astonishingly light. The Marines advanced rapidly across the narrow waist of the island, cutting Okinawa in two. The VI Marine Division turned north while Army divisions pushed south. Within days, they had accomplished objectives planners had estimated would take 3 weeks. The ease of the landing created confusion and suspicion. Where were the Japanese? Why had they abandoned the beaches without a fight? Intelligence estimates had placed Japanese strength at approximately 65,000 troops. Surely they had not simply vanished. They had not. They were waiting in the south in positions that had taken months to prepare. And on April 4th, when American Army divisions reached the outer defenses of the Shuri Line near Kamikaze Ridge, they discovered where the Japanese had gone. The American attack against Kamikaze Ridge on April 9th provided a brutal introduction to the kind of fighting that would characterize the next 2 months. The assault began with heavy preparatory fire from artillery and naval guns. Then tanks and infantry moved forward against what appeared to be a relatively modest ridge. The Americans were advancing into a killing ground. Japanese defenders remained hidden in caves and fortified positions until the attackers were fully exposed. Then they opened fire. Artillery mortars, machine guns, and rifles created overlapping fields of fire that caught American troops in the open. Anti-tank teams armed with satchel charges disabled American armor. Of 30 tanks committed to the initial assault, 22 were destroyed or damaged. The attack failed completely. American forces withdrew, having learned that direct frontal assaults against the Japanese defensive system would be suicidal. But frontal assault was essentially the only option available. The Shuri Line extended across the entire width of southern Okinawa, from the East China Sea to the Pacific Ocean. There were no flanks to turn, no weak points to exploit. The Americans would have to batter their way through position by position, cave by cave, ridge by ridge. And that is what they did. For the next month, American forces launched repeated attacks against the Japanese defenses. Progress was measured in yards. Every hilltop became a fortress. Every ravine became a death trap. Places with innocuous names, Kakazu Ridge, Tombstone Ridge, Item Pocket, the pinnacle became synonymous with nightmare. The fighting was intimate and savage. American infantry, supported by tanks and flamethrowers, would assault a position repeatedly until Japanese defenders were killed or forced to withdraw. Artillery and naval gunfire provided preparation, but ultimately the fighting came down to men with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers clearing caves and bunkers one at a time. The physical and psychological toll was extraordinary. On April 12th, General Isamu Cho, the 32nd Army's aggressive chief of staff, convinced Ushijima to launch a counterattack. Cho believed the Americans were vulnerable and that an offensive could disrupt their advance. Colonel Yahara argued strenuously against the plan, warning that it violated their defensive strategy and would waste troops needlessly. Ushijima sided with Cho. On the night of April 12th, the 32nd Army attacked American positions across the entire front. The assault was well coordinated and sustained, but American firepower was devastating. Artillery mortars and automatic weapons cut down attacking Japanese troops. A second assault the following night met the same fate. A final attack on April 14th was again repulsed with heavy Japanese losses. The counterattack accomplished nothing and cost the 32nd Army more than 500 men troops that could not be replaced. The failure convinced Ushijima and his staff to return to Yahara's defensive strategy. There would be no more large-scale counterattacks. The Japanese would fight from their fortified positions and make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. They succeeded in that goal. Between April 19th and 22, the 34th Corps suffered 2,851 casualties in 4 days of fighting to penetrate the outer defences of the Shuri Line. The casualty rate was unsustainable, but there was no alternative except to continue attacking. While soldiers and Marines struggled against the Shuri Line's ground defences, the United States Navy faced its own ordeal off the coast of Okinawa. Beginning on April 6th, the Japanese launched Operation Kikusui Floating Chrysanthemums, a series of 10 mass kamikaze attacks that would continue throughout the campaign. The kamikaze represented Japan's adaptation to overwhelming American material superiority. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed. Most of its carriers, battleships, and cruisers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Japan still possessed thousands of aircraft, but most were obsolete, and many pilots were poorly trained. Fuel shortages often grounded available planes. In this context, suicide attacks offered a grim calculus. If one aircraft had little chance of hitting a target through conventional attack but could guarantee a hit through suicide, then suicide became tactically rational. The first Kikusui attack on April 6th involved 355 kamikazes and 344 escort fighters. The mass assault lasted 5 hours and overwhelmed American defenses through sheer numbers. Radar picket destroyers stationed north of Okinawa bore the brunt of the attack. 3 destroyers, Bush Colquhoun and Emmons, were sunk. More than 10 other ships were damaged. American and British carriers launched hundreds of sorties to intercept the attackers, shooting down approximately 400 Japanese aircraft, but many kamikazes penetrated the combat air patrol. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. Unlike conventional air attacks, which offered some hope of survival if the enemy missed or was shot down, kamikaze attacks were relentless. Even damaged aircraft continued toward their targets. Ships on radar picket duty knew they were stationed in the most dangerous positions, deliberately placed to draw kamikaze attacks away from the main fleet. For the crews of these vessels, each day brought the near certainty of attack and the possibility of death. 10 Kikusui operations would be launched during the Okinawa campaign, involving approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties. The attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. The Navy suffered 4,907 men killed and 4,024 wounded, the highest naval casualties of any single battle in American history, exceeding even Pearl Harbor. For context, these naval losses alone were nearly equal to Marine Corps casualties in the ground battle. Yet for all their destructive power, the kamikaze attacks failed strategically. No American fleet carriers were sunk. No battleships went down. The attacks damaged the fleet, but did not cripple it. The amphibious operation continued. Supply lines remained intact. American naval air support for ground forces never ceased. The kamikazes inflicted terrible casualties and tested American resolve, but they did not change the course of the battle. The same pattern that plagued the ground defense applied to the kamikaze offensive: tactical success without strategic impact. On April 7th, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation Tengo, a desperate surface action intended to support the air attacks. The battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sorted from Japan with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers. The mission was essentially a suicide run. Yamato carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa, where she was to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. She never reached Okinawa. On April 7th, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 located the Japanese force in the East China Sea. More than 300 American aircraft attacked in waves. Yamato's massive anti-aircraft armament destroyed several attackers, but American torpedo bombers overwhelmed her defenses. Instructed to attack one side to prevent effective counterflooding, the Americans struck with approximately 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. Yamato capsized and exploded, taking 3,055 of her crew to the bottom. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The sacrifice of Yamato and her escorts accomplished nothing except to add to the casualty lists. By early May, American forces had fought their way through the outer defenses of the Shuri Line and were pressing against the main defensive belt. Every advance came at heavy cost. Combat losses were compounded by a new enemy, the weather. On May 21st, torrential rains began. They would continue for 10 days. The battlefield transformed into a muddy nightmare. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks could not reach forward positions. Wounded men lay in flooded foxholes. The dead Japanese and American alike could not be retrieved and began to decompose in the heat and rain. The stench became overwhelming. Roads turned to rivers of mud. Some positions became accessible only by rope. The psychological impact was devastating. Marines and soldiers who had survived weeks of combat found themselves fighting not only the Japanese, but also exhaustion disease and the slow erosion of morale. Combat fatigue casualties soared. Men who had functioned capably under fire suddenly began shaking uncontrollably. Others sat in their foxholes unresponsive, staring at nothing. The rate of psychiatric casualties reached levels unprecedented in the Pacific War. Among the most savage fighting of the entire campaign occurred at a small elevation the Marines designated Sugarloaf Hill. The unassuming rise did not appear particularly formidable when the 6th Marine Division began its assault on May the 12th. The Marines expected to take it in a day or less. 8 days later, they were still fighting for it. Sugarloaf Hill was the key to a mutually supporting defensive system. The Japanese had fortified Sugarloaf Horseshoe Hill and Half Moon Hill so that each position could provide covering fire for the others. Attacking one position brought fire from all 3. The Japanese had also prepared extensive tunnel systems that allowed them to move reinforcements unseen and to reoccupy positions that appeared to have been cleared. For more than a week, Marine companies attacked Sugarloaf repeatedly. They would fight their way to the crest, only to be driven back by counterattacks or artillery fire from the flanking hills. At night, Japanese troops would infiltrate back into positions. The next morning, the attack would begin again. The 6th Marine Division lost 2,662 killed or wounded in the 10-day battle for Sugar Loaf, plus another 289 cases of combat fatigue. The 29th Regiment suffered 82% casualties and effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The cost was appalling, but the Marines took Sugarloaf Hill, and they kept attacking. By late May, the combination of unrelenting pressure and unsustainable casualties convinced General Ushijima that the Shuri Line could no longer be held. The retreat south, prolonging the inevitable. On May 22nd, Ushijima made the decision to withdraw. The 32nd Army would abandon the Shuri Line and establish new defensive positions on the Kaian Peninsula at the southern tip of Okinawa. The withdrawal was a significant military accomplishment. Moving an army while in contact with the enemy is one of the most difficult operations in warfare. The 32nd Army conducted the retreat during the torrential rains, which provided concealment from American air power, but made movement agonizingly difficult. Rear guard units fought delaying actions while the main force moved south. Approximately 30,000 Japanese troops successfully reached the new defensive positions, along with thousands of Okinawan civilians. The Americans did not realize the extent of the withdrawal until they began advancing and found the Shuri positions thinly defended. By early June, American forces had secured Shuri Castle and were pursuing the retreating Japanese south. The withdrawal accomplished Yahara's original strategic objective. It prolonged the battle, but prolonging the battle no longer served any meaningful purpose. There would be no negotiated peace. There would be no last-minute diplomatic settlement. The Americans would not stop attacking because Japanese casualties were high. The fundamental strategic calculation remained unchanged. Japan had lost the war. The final defensive position on the Kaian Peninsula lacked the carefully prepared fortifications of the Shuri Line. It was essentially a desperate last stand by a shattered army. Japanese soldiers fought with the same tenacity they had shown throughout the campaign, but the outcome was inevitable. Admiral Minoru Ota, commanding naval forces at the Oroku Peninsula, committed suicide with his remaining 4,000 men on June 13th, after a week of fighting in their underground headquarters. The peninsula fell to the 6th Marine Division shortly after. By mid-June, the 32nd Army had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance. Communication between units had broken down. Supply had ceased. Large numbers of Japanese soldiers, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, surrendered, an unprecedented occurrence in the Pacific War. Many were Okinawan conscripts rather than regular soldiers, but even Japanese regulars began surrendering in numbers never seen before. On June 18th, Lieutenant General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery fire while observing frontline positions. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the Pacific War. His death, coming so close to the end of the battle, seemed particularly tragic. 4 days later, on June 22nd, organized resistance ended. That night, on Hill 89, at Mabuni, General Ushijima and General Cho prepared for their ritual suicide. Colonel Yahara, the architect of the defensive strategy, requested permission to join them. Ushijima refused. "If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa," the general told him. "Bear the temporary shame, but endure it. This is an order from your army commander." Ushijima and Cho committed seppuku in the traditional manner. Their deaths marked the official end of the Battle of Okinawa. The casualties on Okinawa were staggering. The 32nd Army lost approximately 100,000 men killed. Only about 10,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered or were captured, an unprecedented surrender rate that suggested how thoroughly the army had been destroyed. American casualties totaled 49, 151 battle casualties, 12, 520 killed or missing, and 36, 631 wounded. To these must be added approximately 26,000 non-battle casualties, primarily from combat fatigue, physical exhaustion, and disease. The total American casualty rate was 35% of all forces engaged, extraordinarily high by any standard. The Navy lost 4,907 sailors killed and 824 wounded. 36 ships were sunk and 368 damaged. The psychological toll on sailors subjected to kamikaze attacks was severe and lasting. Marine Corps and Army losses were distributed across the campaign's 82 days of fighting. Some units suffered catastrophic casualties. The 96th Infantry Division sustained more than 7,000 casualties. The 1st Marine Division had 765 casualties. Individual rifle companies were sometimes reduced to 30 or 40 effective men by the end of the campaign. The rate of psychiatric casualties was unprecedented. Approximately 26,000 men were evacuated for combat fatigue, nearly equal to the number of men wounded in action. At Okinawa, psychiatric casualties represented 48% of all combat-related casualties, compared to approximately 25% in European theatre operations. Some veterans of the campaign suffered psychological effects for the rest of their lives. The most tragic casualties were the Okinawan civilians. At least 100,000 civilians died during the battle, possibly as many as 150,000. Some were killed in the crossfire between American and Japanese forces. Others were coerced into group suicide by Japanese soldiers who insisted that American troops would torture and murder them. Families killed their own children to spare them from imagined atrocities. The forced civilian casualties remain one of the war's great tragedies. From a tactical perspective, the Japanese defense of Okinawa was masterful. Yahara's defensive scheme forced the Americans into a bloody, grinding battle of attrition. The 32nd Army inflicted casualties far exceeding Japanese losses on previous islands. The kamikaze attacks inflicted the highest naval casualties of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and discipline, making the Americans pay for every position, and none of it mattered strategically. Japan lost Okinawa for several fundamental reasons that tactical excellence could not overcome. First, the strategic situation was hopeless. By April 1945, Japan had lost the war. The question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but when and how. American industrial capacity produced aircraft ships and equipment faster than Japan could destroy them. The submarine blockade had strangled Japan's economy. American forces controlled the sea and air. There was no realistic scenario in which Japan could force a favorable peace. Second, the attrition strategy failed its basic premise. The Japanese hoped that inflicting heavy casualties would make the Americans lose their will to continue the war. Instead, the casualties at Okinawa convinced American leaders that an invasion of the home islands would be unacceptably costly. This conclusion led directly to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese strategy of defensive attrition thus hastened the very catastrophe it sought to prevent. Third, Japan could not replace its losses. The 32nd Army was destroyed on Okinawa. Those 100,000 men could not be reconstituted. The 1,900 kamikaze pilots and their aircraft were gone. The resources consumed in the battle could not be recovered. American forces, by contrast, could replace their losses. New divisions were training in the United States. New ships were leaving the shipyards. Damaged vessels were repaired and returned to service. The Americans could absorb the losses and continue. Japan could not. Fourth time was Japan's enemy, not its ally. Every day the war continued, Japan's position worsened. American forces captured more territory. Strategic bombing destroyed more cities. The blockade tightened. The Soviet Union prepared to enter the war against Japan. Prolonging the war through attrition did not serve Japanese interests. It simply extended the agony. Fifth, the Japanese defensive strategy had no positive outcome. Even if the 32nd Army had somehow succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation, if they had inflicted even heavier casualties, if the kamikaze attacks had sunk more ships, the strategic situation would not have changed. The Americans would have paused, regrouped, and returned with more forces. There was no scenario in which defending Okinawa led to Japanese victory or even to a negotiated peace. The strategy amounted to dying well rather than surviving poorly. General Ushijima understood this reality. In messages to Tokyo, he acknowledged that Okinawa would fall. His goal was to delay the Americans and inflict casualties. He succeeded in both objectives. But success in those objectives did not translate to strategic success because the objectives themselves were strategically meaningless. The fundamental flaw in Japanese strategy was that it treated the battle for Okinawa as though the outcome of the battle mattered to the war's conclusion. It did not. Okinawa would fall regardless of how well the Japanese fought. The war would continue regardless of how many casualties the 32nd Army inflicted. The only question was how many men would die before Japan accepted the inevitable. The Battle of Okinawa concluded on June 22, 1945. 7 weeks later, on August 6th, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The connection between Okinawa and Hiroshima is direct and undeniable. American planners studying the Okinawa casualties projected that an invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese home island, would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, with more than 100,000 dead. The invasion of the main island of Honshu would be even bloodier. Estimates ranged from 500,000 to more than 1 million American casualties. Japanese civilian and military casualties would number in the millions. President Harry Truman and his advisors faced a choice: authorize use of the atomic bomb or proceed with an invasion that would dwarf the carnage of Okinawa. The battle that Japan had fought so skillfully and courageously had demonstrated exactly what an invasion of the home islands would cost. The Japanese defensive tactics had proven effective. The willingness of soldiers to fight to the death was established. The use of civilian militia and suicide attacks was confirmed. The lesson American leaders drew from Okinawa was not negotiate with Japan, but rather do not invade Japan. The atomic bomb offered an alternative to invasion, a way to force surrender without repeating Okinawa on a massive scale. Japan's strategy of defensive attrition thus achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than convince the Americans to accept less than unconditional surrender, it convinced them to use the most terrible weapon ever created to avoid another Okinawa. This is the central tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese 32nd Army fought brilliantly and died courageously in service of a strategy that was fundamentally counterproductive. Every casualty they inflicted strengthened the American argument for using atomic weapons. Every day they prolonged the battle brought the atomic bomb closer to reality. Military historians assess battles according to whether they achieved their strategic objectives. By that standard, the Battle of Okinawa was an American victory and a Japanese defeat despite the tactical excellence of the Japanese defense. The Americans achieved all their strategic objectives. They captured Okinawa. They gained control of airfields from which they could launch strategic bombing missions and fighter escorts against Japan. They secured anchorages for the invasion fleet. They eliminated the last major defensive position between their forces and the Japanese home islands. The battle was costly, but it was successful. The Japanese achieved none of their strategic objectives. They did not prevent the capture of Okinawa. They did not force the Americans to pause their advance. They did not convince Washington to negotiate. They did not buy sufficient time for the home islands to prepare adequate defenses. They did not change the strategic situation. They fought a brilliant defensive battle that accomplished nothing except to add more names to the casualty lists. The individual courage and tactical skill displayed by the 32nd Army cannot be questioned. Japanese soldiers fought with discipline and determination under impossible circumstances. They inflicted casualties far exceeding any previous Pacific Island battle. They demonstrated that prepared defensive positions properly utilized could exact a terrible toll on attacking forces. But courage and tactical skill cannot overcome strategic impossibility. Japan had lost the war before the Battle of Okinawa began. The outcome was determined by industrial capacity, resource availability, naval strength, and air superiority. All factors that overwhelmingly favored the United States. The Battle of Okinawa could not change those realities. It could only add to the war's casualty figures. The question that haunts the battle's history is whether the sacrifice was necessary. Would Japan have surrendered if Okinawa had not been defended? almost certainly not Japanese military leadership was committed to fighting to the last. But the fierce defense of Okinawa made the atomic bomb seem like the merciful option. By demonstrating how costly an invasion would be, Japan inadvertently justified the use of weapons that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Battle of Okinawa offers several enduring lessons about strategy and warfare. First, tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic failure. The Japanese fought the battle as well as any force could under the circumstances. But fighting well in a losing cause simply means losing with higher casualties. Second, attrition strategies require the ability to replace losses. If your enemy can replace casualties, and you cannot, then attrition favors your enemy, regardless of the initial casualty ratio. Third, defensive battles without offensive follow-through lead nowhere. The 32nd Army's defensive strategy had no mechanism for transitioning to victory. It could delay, inflict casualties, and die bravely, but it could not win. Fourth, national strategy must be grounded in realistic assessment of the strategic situation. Japanese leaders knew they could not win the war militarily, yet they continued to plan as though military success were possible. The result was the needless deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Fifth, the psychological and moral costs of war extend far beyond battle deaths. The combat fatigue casualties at Okinawa, the trauma suffered by survivors, and the civilian deaths cast long shadows. War damages societies in ways that persist for generations. Okinawa remains a powerful symbol in both American and Japanese consciousness. For Americans, it represents the horrifying cost of defeating Japan and the justification for using atomic weapons. For Japanese, it represents the sacrifice of Okinawan civilians and soldiers in a doomed cause. For Okinawans, it remains a tragedy that destroyed their society and subjected their island to decades of foreign military occupation. The airfields the Americans captured on Okinawa remain in use today. Kadena Air Base is one of the largest and most important American military installations in the Pacific. The continued American military presence on Okinawa remains controversial, a reminder that the battle's consequences extend to the present day. On the morning of June the 23rd, 1945, the 10th Army conducted a flag-raising ceremony at its headquarters. The American flag rose above Okinawa, symbolizing the island's capture. General Joseph Stilwell, who had assumed command after Buckner's death, stood at attention as a band played the national anthem. The ceremony was somber. There was little celebration. The men who had fought the battle understood what it had cost. The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. It killed more than 250,000 people. It demonstrated the Japanese military's willingness to fight to the death. It showed that suicide tactics could inflict terrible casualties. It proved that prepared defensive positions, skillfully defended, could make every advance agonizingly costly. And it changed nothing. Japan would have lost the war if Okinawa had fallen in a week with minimal resistance. Japan would have lost if the 32nd Army had never existed. The strategic outcome was determined by factors far beyond the control of the soldiers dying on Okinawa's ridges and in its caves. The battle was tactically significant, but strategically irrelevant. That is the tragedy at the heart of the Battle of Okinawa. Thousands of men died courageously, skillfully, and pointlessly in service of a strategy that could not succeed. The Japanese fought to delay the inevitable, and they succeeded in delaying it by a few weeks, while killing tens of thousands of people on all sides. The lesson of Okinawa is not that the Japanese fought poorly or that the Americans won easily. The lesson is that tactical excellence and individual courage cannot overcome strategic impossibility. When a nation's fundamental strategic position is hopeless, fighting, well, simply means dying well. It does not mean winning. Japan lost Okinawa not on the blood-soaked ridges of the Shuri Line, or in the caves of the Khiam Peninsula, but in the shipyards of the United States, the oil fields of Southeast Asia that Japan could no longer access, and the strategic decisions made in 1941 that led to war with America. The Battle of Okinawa was merely the final demonstration of what had already been decided Japan would lose, and the only question was how many would die before that loss was acknowledged. General Ushijima understood this truth. Before his death, he issued a final message to his troops. "My only worry is that I have been unable to reward you for your loyal service." The general had fought as well as any commander could. His soldiers had fought with extraordinary courage, but fighting well in an impossible situation is its own tragedy. The sun set on the Japanese Empire at Okinawa, not because the 32nd Army failed tactically, but because Japan had failed strategically years before. The battle simply made the failure explicit, written in blood, on an island that never should have been a battlefield.